all for coming out tonight for our featured webinar on winter finches. So I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening. Oh, I guess I should introduce myself first. My name is Tony DeSantis, and with us is Julia Plummer. We're both with Pennsylvania Society of Ornithology, and we're happy to have Matt Schenck with us this evening. Matt is a professional naturalist and educator who's been helping to facilitate positive experiences in, for, and about the outdoors for over 10 years now. Matt's born and raised in North Central Pennsylvania and is a graduate of Lock Haven University, my alma mater, where he received a BS in Outdoor Recreation Management with a minor in Environmental Studies. And after college, Matt headed down south to be an environmental educator in Georgia, and then went up to New England to be a camp director in Rhode Island before coming on back to Pennsylvania to pursue a career as an educator with Pennsylvania DCNR. He started with DCNR at Kinswell Bridge State Park, then transferred over to R.B. Winter State Park, where we're just talking about their breeding crossbills. And now, for the past year, Matt is at his forever park as the environmental education specialist at Sinnamahoning State Park. Matt's biggest outdoor passion is birds and birding, but he also enjoys biking Pennsylvania's many designated bike trails and exploring the PA wilds with his wife, Susan. So I will let Matt take it away. So thank you, Matt, for being here.
Thanks, Tony. I appreciate the introduction. I am very happy to be here and really excited to be able to give a talk for PSO tonight, and super excited about the triple-digit participation. Glad to see 100 folks in attendance. That's super awesome. Finch Fest is the program that we're talking about today. That's an exploration of winter finches and their identification, because I do work for Pennsylvania State Parks. I'm getting my clicker working here. Maybe. Not quite. No. See if my button works. There we go. All right. So because I work for Pennsylvania State Parks, I always like to start all of my programs, whether they're in person or virtual like this one, just giving folks an opportunity to see the mission of Pennsylvania State Parks. So just take a couple of seconds and read through that. So our mission with state parks is twofold. We're here to provide opportunities for outdoor recreation, and we're here to teach folks about the environment and the outdoors in our outdoor classrooms. Birding and wildlife watching is an outdoor recreation opportunity. And then tonight we're going to be learning about a specific group of birds, where and when to look for those birds and what to look and listen for. That covers our environmental education component. So I want to thank all of y'all for being here. That's the reason I have a job and that I'm on camera tonight. So I appreciate that. A lot of folks tuned in, said they have been to Sinnamahoning State Park. A couple of folks said they haven't. This is where it's located. So we are located right where the Christmas tree icon is. So we are roughly halfway between Interstate 80 and Route 6 in North Central Pennsylvania. We're pretty much dead center in the PA Wilds region, about an hour and a half north of State College, about 30 miles south of Coudersport. A really easy way to describe it would be that I am tuning in from the woods today. This is a very remote part of Pennsylvania. Great place to find finches. The park actually has been quite good for the last couple of months for finches, but just giving you an idea of where in the state I'm located. And I also live in Tioga County, which is in northern Pennsylvania, pretty close to Route 6. All right, so for today's program, Finch Fest, I'll start off by mentioning that the photo on the screen right now is one of the few photos I will use in this program that I did not actually take in Pennsylvania. That's a red crossbill from Iowa a couple of years ago. But just a loose breakdown for the program. So we have three major parts we're going to go over. First is, what is a winter finch? What makes them different from other finches? Are all finches winter finches? We'll answer those questions. Second is, what's the normal range for winter finches? And I'll go over some of the basics of their eruptive movements. So what makes an eruption? And then where I'll try to spend most of our time is finding and locating finches in Pennsylvania, so winter finches. So that third part will be stretched out a little bit, and there'll be some time for questions throughout. So in between each part, we'll take a brief break, and if folks have questions, we can do that. So we'll start off with what is a winter finch. A lot of you are probably very competent birders. And if you've not heard winter finch, you might be thinking to yourself, well, I have a bird like this, American goldfinch, that's either in my local birding patch or it's in my backyard at my feeders pretty much year round. I don't only see them in the winter, I see them throughout the year. They breed in the state. And that's correct. And I don't consider goldfinch to be one of our winter finches. Other folks might. But the not being present in the state year round is not the only thing that would separate winter finches from our standard American goldfinch or house finch. One species of winter finch, purple finch, actually is a year-round resident, and it actually breeds in the state. And I wouldn't necessarily call it uncommon, especially up here in northern Pennsylvania, around Sinnamahoning State Park. Much more common to find purple finches than house finches. But there are some years where purple finch numbers are greatly bloated in Pennsylvania. So there's a certain number of local residents that are breeding around the state. And some years there's a lot more purple finches than what would normally be here for the breeding season. That's what separates our winter finches. They're moving, excuse me, irregularly in a type of movement and migration pattern that's known as an irruption. Some of them are year-round residents like purple finches. Most are not. So when we're talking about winter finches, we're talking about things like siskins. Some of them could be around in the breeding season, but the vast majority of the population is found outside of Pennsylvania during the breeding season. Some winter finches, like common redpolls, are almost never present in Pennsylvania. It's really only in eruption years and around those eruption years that we see them. Otherwise, they're breeding pretty far away from the state. We also have some specialized birds in this group, the crossbills, red and white-winged crossbill. Red crossbill, I think we could technically call it a year-round resident. They can be found pretty much at any time in the state, but they're very sporadic. And they're not nearly as common as a breeding species as something like, say, purple finch, and certainly not as something as common as a goldfinch. And then we have the big show finches, showy finches. So the grosbeaks, evening grosbeak and pine grosbeak, they also do not breed in the state of Pennsylvania, and they're only found here during those eruption years. So that's really what separates these winter finches from our standard resident species, the goldfinch and the house finch, is that irregular, sporadic movement, that migration type that we call an eruption, and the fact that they're not typically found in the state. It makes this group of birds a really exciting frontier for learning new skills in bird watching, and especially for us up here in northern Pennsylvania, which can get real cold and real slow with birds in the winter. This group of birds in particular offers a really nice sort of reward for getting out in those harsh winter conditions. If you spend some time on a trail at 10 degrees Fahrenheit, but you get to see a flock of evening grosbeaks, it feels worth it, more worth it than if you just got a flock of chickadees out of the endeavor. So any question? Sorry, we went too far. Any questions in the chat about what constitutes our winter finches that I'm going to be going over tonight?
We don't have any questions yet, but if anyone wants to put a question in, go ahead.
We can wait a couple seconds. That's no big deal. All right. If anybody does think of any questions, I have a period to stop in between each section. That'll give you some time. And you can also type them in the chat at any time. And Julia, you can relay them when we have those breaks. So, all right. So we talked about what is a winter finch.
We did
now we're going to talk.
Question. If you, sorry.
Go ahead. No worries.
How many finches are there?
I don't know the answer to that question off the top of my head. In general, I would say a lot. hundreds probably. In terms of our winter finches in North America, it's less than 10 species that we're talking about here in Pennsylvania. In terms of the ones that are not here every single year, we're talking about pine siskin, common redpoll, hoary redpoll, the two crossbills, evening grosbeak, pine grosbeak. So 7 species in Pennsylvania.
Right. Robert wants to know, how late in the spring do the finches stay?
That's a great question. Depends on the spring, depends on the species. So some species like red crossbill, they'll stick around as long as there's food. So there's been red crossbills, especially in the Pennsylvania Wilds region. We've had red crossbills since at least 2020, and there's not really been a break in them being around. At this point, I think I found them in almost every county in the wilds in that span. I find them randomly. I had a flyover in my yard in Wellsboro in July last year. That was probably related to an eruption that was occurring at the time. But we also had plentiful red crossbills in 2021 and 2022. So that species will stick around as long as there's food. They sort of just move around locating food. Other species like the redpolls, they're probably gone by the time we hit April. I don't recall hearing any the last major eruption of redpolls after April 1st. Evening grosbeaks are an interesting one, though. They take a little bit longer to trickle back up. And for those of us in the northern part of the state, it's not unusual to have them into May and even towards late May. I recorded evening grosbeaks on the eBird May Big Day in 2021. So they were around, and I had photos of them with the breeding plumage on the bill color. So they do stick around quite late. Most of them are probably gone. Most winter finches are probably gone by the start of May, with the stragglers being gone by the end of May. But birds sort of distribution, there's always outliers. So there's nothing to say that you couldn't find an individual of any of these species at any time.
Right. And Ed would like to know if eruption means they appear in flocks.
Yes. So sometimes in flocks, sometimes as individuals. The term eruption in general just means that big numbers of one or more of these species are going to be moving away from their breeding grounds. So when we think about bird migration, we mostly think about northbound migrants in the spring migrating to their breeding habitats, and then southbound migrants in the fall leaving to go to their wintering grounds. These species don't necessarily migrate north, south, east, or west. They could go in multiple directions. They're mainly following food. So their eruption is that it describes the phenomenon of how there could be no evening grosbeaks in Pennsylvania one year, and the following winter, they're falling out of the trees everywhere. So you have these continent-wide movements of individual species, sometimes multiple species, that are all in the search of food, but they're not necessarily regular movements year after year. Great questions.
Great, thank you. I think those are the questions for now.
Good. We will go ahead and move forward. So we talked about what is a winter finch. Let's talk a little bit more about where these birds are normally found and the basics of those eruptive movements. So where are all these finches coming from? Well, the technical term is the boreal forest. Boreal forest is a descriptive term for a large forest that's made primarily of conifer trees. So that's your spruces, tamarack, hemlock, pines. Think of species that have cones and the seeds that are in those cones. There's some other important tree species as well, particularly birch and some of the hardwood trees. Mainly maples, important seed trees, and most of the boreal forest in North America. Sorry, I don't know what's going on with my PowerPoint. There we go. So most of our boreal forest in North America is found in Canada and Alaska. That's where the bulk of these birds are found. You'll notice I didn't go all the way up through Nunavut and those most northerly territories of Canada. The reason for that is because we're interested in the forest and there aren't a lot of trees up there. That's Arctic tundra. So we're talking primarily the areas south of the Hudson Bay and then extending north towards Alaska and into Alaska. That's not the only boreal forest. In fact, there's pockets of boreal forest in Pennsylvania and down the Appalachians. But there's another major area of boreal forest in North America, and that would be the Western US, particularly high elevation areas in the mountain ranges like the Rockies, the Sierra Nevadas, the Cascades. Those higher elevation areas have a lot of conifer tree density, but also in the Western US, conifer tree diversity is a little bit higher, just like it is in the boreal forest. Here in Pennsylvania, our conifer density is a little bit lower. We have fewer species of native spruce. They do better in a little bit harsher environment, typically found further to the north. But like I said, there are pockets of boreal forest in Pennsylvania as well. So this is primarily where these species are breeding. Red crossbill is a little bit of an exception. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Pennsylvania is not far from the southern end of the breeding range. So talking about southern Ontario, Quebec, portions of northern New England, the Adirondacks in New York. Those are areas where these finches are found pretty regularly and also breeding, and they're not too far from Pennsylvania. So you don't necessarily have to wait for a Pennsylvania winter and an eruption year. You could go up to Canada or northern New England and check those places out too. All right, so what drives the birds out of those areas? In some years and other years not, it's food availability. So we're talking about a group of birds that in the wintertime is feeding almost exclusively on seeds. And if the trees in those boreal regions do not produce enough seeds to sustain the populations of birds that are living there that winter, they will leave. And that's what's happening whenever we see those finches arrive in Pennsylvania. It's not necessarily that we have an abundance of food here. They have no way of knowing that until they get here. But it does mean that wherever they were, there wasn't a whole lot of food. Some years that could be a specific type of tree. You can see on the diagram, this is a really great illustration done by Jillian Dittner, which I found online. I think it does a great job showing the bill shapes of the birds and the typical food items that they would pursue. Take, for instance, red crossbill here, which feeds almost exclusively on conifer cones. If there's a large population of red crossbills feeding in an area of the boreal forest, and that area doesn't produce cones, they will leave and basically follow the forest until they find suitable foraging areas again, and they will settle down again. Each of these species has a type of food that they sort of specialize in, but red and white-winged crossbill are especially specialized. So they only feed primarily on cones, whereas pine siskin is at the top, and they do feed on a lot of white spruce cones, and in spruce forest, pine siskins are quite common. Pine siskins will also feed on deciduous tree seeds. For instance, here at Sinnamahoning, we've had a really nice flock rate around the Wildlife Center for about the last 4 months. And they started out feeding on sycamores, seeded sycamores. They've been feeding a lot on alder catkins lately, but they will also fly up into the white pines and feed on the significant white pine cone crop we have here. So a lot of them are a little more general than the crossbills are. They'll feed on a variety of different types of seeds. But in the boreal forest, they might not have that species of tree seed available to them where they bred, so they have to move. And again, these movements are not just north to south. These birds could be coming south from Canada, which is, I think, typically how we would think about the eruption of finches. We think they're coming from Canada, so they're coming down from the south. But you can see there's a significant portion of that forest to the north and the west. So they could be coming southwest into Pennsylvania. In the red crossbill field, red crossbills that were moving into Pennsylvania this summer were coming from the western US. It's particularly the Pacific coast. They started showing up in Minnesota and the upper Midwest first. They were recorded to call type, so we know where they were coming from. And they ended up in Pennsylvania by August. And we also had red crossbills in the state of Pennsylvania before that. Those are a different call type. So by analyzing the recordings, we could tell that the crossbills moving in the summer, and the ones that are breeding at RB Winter are different call types. They're coming from the Western US, and that was explained by a cone crop in the Western US that was pretty good, a spruce cone crop. And after 2 or 3 years, the birds depleted that cone crop and they left in the middle of the summer to find a new foraging area. And they ended up in the Northeast and the upper Midwest. Finches are not the only species that have eruptive tendencies. In fact, a lot of northern species we're starting to notice do this sort of irregular movement associated with food. One of the most well-known ones is snowy owl. So snowy owl erupts not based on tree seeds because they don't eat tree seeds, they eat lemmings. But when lemming populations are high, we have lots of snowy owl breeding, and then we have lots of snowy owls, and all the young birds have to come south because they don't know how to survive in the Arctic winter. But we also have crashing lemming population some years, and then there's no food, and then all of the snowy owls have to come further south from their normal winter range to survive that. So snowy owl is a well-known one. Another one that I find interesting, and I don't know where the research is at on whether or not this is truly an eruptive species, but it's certainly one that when I lived in New England and also some of the years I've been here in Pennsylvania, I've noticed northern shrike tends to come south in big numbers some years and fewer numbers in other years. And that may actually be explained by the same tree fruiting phenomenon that's pushing the finches around, because northern shrike are eating small birds and they're eating small mammals, which are probably feeding on those tree seeds. So again, I'm not sure if there's research on why some years there's more northern shrikes than others, but it could be explained by the same reason that we know finches are moving. But both of these species, some years we get several, some years we get very few, some years we get a lot. So not just finches. Any questions?
If you have a question, go ahead and put your question in the chat. We don't have an easy way to give people audio access. And I don't see any yet, but we can pause if you like.
Yeah, that's okay. Give me a chance to stay hydrated here.
Okay. So Chad asks, oh, do the other finch family get the same diseases as house finches get?
That's a great question. I don't know. I want to say that they should be susceptible. They're all in that same family. Typically with diseases, that's how it would work. But I'm not positive. I don't know. Certainly the conditions of how these birds are moving around would make them susceptible. They often show up at feeders in big, dense flocks. And you know anything about avian influenza, that's the problem with that. But also other bird diseases like the house finch eye disease. But I don't know for sure if they actually are susceptible to it or not.
Another question. John asks, is the abundance of wildfires in Canada this year expected to have a big influence on finch population / movements?
Big, no, I don't think, but it will influence it. And the reason why I say that I don't feel like it would create a big issue for finches, this is something that was talked about on the ABA birding podcast. A lot of land burned in Canada, but that forest is massive. Like it's like the size of the continental United States. So while a lot of habitat was likely negatively impacted, there's still so much area up there with forests that I think overall, I don't know that you would see a population level effect from it, but locally, definitely, it will definitely have an impact locally on some of them. Some species, and we saw that last fall migration, not necessarily that we know it was tied to it, but there were many species that breed in the boreal forests last fall that were coming through extremely early on migration, which could have been an indicator of failed breeding due to those problems. So things like Cape May warbler and stuff like that. There were individuals that were moving through very early, and for me looking at it, I was like, well, it seems like this is like a really early push of Cape May warbler, and that could be something that was playing into that.
Great. We also Oscar asks, do any of these finches breed in Cameron and Potter County?
Yep. So purple finch definitely. Red crossbill, fingers crossed. I think they were probably red crossbill. I think was probably breeding in the park this summer, and I tried, but I was too busy to actually spend the amount of time out there that I needed to confirm them. But those would be the two right off the top of my head that I would think. Pine siskin's probably possible, but less likely than red crossbill. Purple finch for sure. They are a breeding species throughout Cameron and Potter County.
Great. That's all the questions I see right now.
All right. Okay, hopefully I went forward. So we've gone through the first two sections of our talk, and now we're going to move into where we're going to spend the majority of the time, which is talking about finding finches in Pennsylvania. So you're all amped up after this talk, hopefully, and you want to go out there and you want to find some finches. And the first rule I would tell you is that you want to make sure, if you're looking for something, that there's a pretty good chance that it's going to be around, especially with birds that you know are not in the state every single year. So the first rule of thumb with going out and searching for finches is check the finch forecast. Now, a lot of you have probably heard of the finch forecast. It's been around since the 1990s. Ron Pittaway, a world-famous Ontario birder and another naturalist, did a great job establishing the finch forecast. It's since been passed off to Tyler Hoare, and Tyler Hoare and this organization, the Finch Research Network, put out the forecast every year now. It's a fantastic resource, usually goes out late summer, early fall, and they update it as they go. So like the finch forecast for last winter was in place, and then once we started to see those crossbills moving in midsummer, that's actually how I knew to be looking for them, was that there was an update to the forecast that said red crossbills are on the move. Type 2 and type 4 are being recorded in Minnesota and Wisconsin. They were just in the Pacific coast. And it wasn't but a couple of weeks after I read that post that we had Dave Brook camping in the park here, and he brought in recordings of crossbills from the campground. So the forecast tells you what's hopefully going to be around, what to look for, and it has a lot of good information for each species on how they are probably going to be feeding on certain species of trees, like what exactly to look for in each individual year. This forecast is not random, so it takes a lot of effort. What essentially is happening is they are connecting a bunch of people in Canada, primarily in Canada, although there's more reporting done in the United States now than initially. It started in Canada, that's why it's so focused on Canada, but also that's where the majority of the birds are. So they're connecting forestry professionals, biologists, people who are out in these very remote areas of the boreal forest. They're sending them a survey with a list of tree species, and they're rating the seed crop for that year for each species, and then also indicating what finches they're seeing and where they're seeing them. So all that comes back and is compiled together, and we get basically a picture of what the seed crop looks like across the Canadian boreal forest. And if it looks really bad, that means that pretty much all those birds are going to move. And it's predicting in what direction they go that's sort of the tricky part. But most years, what it is some parts of the boreal forest have low cone crops, other parts have better cone crops. So they're really talking about how they think the birds are going to move around. And sometimes when there's a good cone crop or a good seed crop of multiple types of trees, they'll straight up say, not looking like a good year for an eruption, or certain species like pine grosbeak. If there's a lot of fruit and berries and mountain ash seed crops in the boreal forest, that species isn't likely to move. So they'll indicate that stuff on the forecast. So it's a really great resource. The other thing that the forecast does is it brings to light how birds that we probably see regularly can actually tell us more about what's going on. So they have three non-finch species that they also highlight. And one is red-breasted nuthatch, and another is blue jay. The third is Bohemian waxwing. That's a little more of a stretch. But blue jay and red-breasted nuthatch are common birds in Pennsylvania. The difference being that blue jays are migratory. Some folks don't know that. They do migrate, and especially the birds from the north, when the seed crops are low, they come back down in big numbers. And so seeing a lot of blue jays that are all orienting themselves the same direction in like August is a pretty good sign. And up here in northern Pennsylvania, red-breasted nuthatch is fairly common, but it's very restricted by habitat. And so you know where you're likely to find red-breasted nuthatch. And what I notice is that usually by the end of July, in eruption years, there are red-breasted nuthatches in places where there shouldn't be. And those are probably northern birds that are leaving the boreal forest because of a lack of food. And that was true when I lived in Rhode Island too. The western part of Rhode Island was a lot of pine forests, a lot of red-breasted nuthatches. Coastal Rhode Island, not so much. When I got red-breasted nuthatches in August at my coastal migrant traps, that was usually a good year for pine siskin. Might get crossbills, sometimes even redpolls, but it's a good early indicator to look for. So that Finch forecast is available. The Finch Research Network is relatively easy to find. You just Google Finch Research Network, it'll come right up. The forecast, if you click the three little dots, you can go right down to it. So check that forecast before you decide you're going to go out and go find finches. If they're not moving, you're going to be really disappointed, and it's a lot less fun. All right, so study up on your visual and auditory clues before you hit the field. So this is something that's a good idea for any type of birding, but we've all been out birding and had the opportunity to see a really accommodating bird that let you leaf through the field guide to try to figure out what it is. But if you're looking at this flock here, I took this photo in Warren County in 2021. These are common redpolls. I went to this spot because there was at least one, probably two hoary redpolls that were feeding in the sunflower field that had a lot of weedy seed heads. There were also about 100 common redpolls. And I can tell you this about a flock of redpolls: you are not going to be able to stand there and analyze an individual bird and flip through your field guide or your app to try to compare. You want to get a baseline idea of what you're looking for before you go out. And then you can try to find the field marks on the bird you're looking for. So I knew what I was looking for in a hoary redpoll when I got to this field. I spent the whole time I was there looking at individual birds and deciding whether or not they had a field mark that I was looking for. I eventually found the hoary redpoll in there. It took a long time, but these birds were flying all around. They were going to different seed heads. They're really hard to follow individuals. So you don't want to be out in the field flipping through your field guide trying to figure that out. You want to try to do that studying before you go. Okay, so now we're going to start talking about the individual species and what exactly to look and listen for while you're in the field. So the first one I'll start with is probably the most common, the easiest eruptive finch to get on the other side of your binoculars, I would say, and that's pine siskin. Pine siskin is a small finch, very similar to a goldfinch. I often describe them as a streaky goldfinch with a pointier bill. That's what they look like right there. This photo was taken during the 2020 eruption. So this was October 2020. And you can tell the bird's on a paved street. This is Franklin Street in Smethport, Pennsylvania. There was a flock of at least 50 more pine siskins right behind this one, going through the leaves and the pavement, looking for seeds, looking for something to eat. And 2020 was a great flight year for pine siskins. So you're looking for something that looks a little bit like a goldfinch and occasionally sounds like a goldfinch. And now I'm going to try to open up eBird and we'll see how this works. Okay. That's not the one we want. We'll go back. What in the heck? We'll try it from the start. And we'll put it in one name. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to play some flight calls for you. Now, if you're a birder and you're a little bit apprehensive about flight calls, don't worry. We're not talking about nocturnal flight calls. We're not talking about chips and zips here. Finch flight calls are actually pretty distinctive. They're typically loud, which is great. So they're a little bit easier to hear and they really stand out. And especially on the backdrop of calls that you're really used to. So I really recommend looking into the finch flight calls. It is my preferred method for finding finches. If you have trouble with your hearing, these are totally birds you can find without flight calls, but I am going to cover the flight calls because I think it's an important component. But keep in mind that all these birds are findable without actually learning the calls. So I'm going to play one here. So first of all, this the flight call here is descending nasally, almost like a sneeze. So I'll play that. Got that one. See if I can pull another one up that maybe has a little better quality. So that sort of descending sneezy quality. And then another thing I'll point out is that these pine siskins are closely related to goldfinches. So they make calls that are very similar to goldfinches, like this one. And that tornado, we call that almost like a northern parola. That is also a distinctive call for pine siskin as well. They call it the tornado call. All right. Let's go back to our PowerPoint here. All right, so that's the pine siskin. Again, all these species are being driven from their normal range by a lack of food. And so dialing into the foods that they prefer will help you find them. Like I said, this diagram shows pine siskin being really closely tied to white spruce, which it is. But I have found that it's a species that you can often find on deciduous trees that have catkins, especially birch, alder. This is the first year I've ever seen them feed on sycamore, but they were all about that. And then also feeding on the cones of pine trees. So a good one to look for there. Okay, so red poles. Red poles are like super exciting siskins. They don't come down as often as siskins do. Siskins almost seem biannual. Some years not so much, but usually siskin is like every other year. Common red pole is not making it into Pennsylvania every other year. Although some years, some eruptions, it could be on a rolling basis like that. Common redpoll is another one. It's very similar to American goldfinch, although it's not the same color. It's a gray and white with a red forehead. So a little bit different in coloration, but similar in shape. Small, pointy bill, similar to a siskin as well, and does make some vocalizations that are similar to pine siskin and American goldfinch, that sort of rising call that we just heard. So common redpoll is actually a really good one for the flight call. Siskin has a distinctive flight call, but common redpoll is really great. It's a raspy chid chid chid, which I think sounds like a typewriter, but it's a little bit more musical than a typewriter. Matt Young, the Cornell's crossbill guy, I had misidentified a common redpoll flight call when I lived in Rhode Island. I thought it was a white-winged crossbill, and he had emailed me and was like, I don't think this is a white-winged crossbill, but he had gave me a great piece of advice, which is that common redpoll, the raspy flight calls are very similar to white-winged crossbill, but they have the same cadence as a goldfinch. So if you're familiar with goldfinch's flight call, the potato chip, potato chip, potato chip, the redpoll has the same cadence, but it's very raspy. So I'll find that one here. Okay. Oh, it's already set to me. Okay. All right. I got another one I can play here soon. I don't know why that keeps zooming in. Let's see. I had a really good one from McKean County. I think this is it. All right. Back to PowerPoint. So that's the common redpoll, and common redpoll is a species of finch that's a little bit unique. They do feed on some conifer seeds, although mostly from small coned conifers. So like tamarack and some of the native spruces, not Norway spruce, which has big cones. But common redpolls are much more closely aligned with birch trees. So they feed on birch catkins, birch cones, and the part of the finch forecast that forecasts redpolls is the birch cone crop, especially in northeastern Canada. So redpolls are the ones that are going by Tadoussac in Quebec, that migratory stopover. So they're coming from mostly northeastern Canada, although they are found across the boreal forest all the way up into Alaska. They're fairly common breeders up there too. But they're tied to extensive birch forests and birch catkins. So that's where I look for redpolls. I look for stands of birch that have plenty of catkins or plenty of cones. The other thing to look for is weedy fields. They're similar to a goldfinch. They will feed on goldenrod seed heads. They will feed on asters. The rain garden at Kinsey Bridge State Park in 2020 was fantastic. There's a flock of like 15 of them in there. And redpolls live where people don't normally. So where they're breeding, there are not really people. So they are incredibly approachable. The flock at Kinsey Bridge let me walk right up to them, and I sat in the rain garden with them landing all over me for, I don't know, 20, 30 minutes, which is really great. A lot of these finches can be that way, not all of them, but a lot of them are coming from really remote areas. They don't deal with people all that often. So they will sometimes let you get closer than, sometimes significantly closer than birds you might be otherwise used to. There are 2 red poles. Well, there may be more than 2, there may be less than 2. Scientists are figuring that out. But right now they say there's at least 2 in North America, common and hoary red pole. So in this picture, this is McKean County, McKean County, so just between Eldred and Bradford. It's a male common red pole on the left, and I'm not sure of the sex, but it's a hairy red pole on the right, or a hoary red pole on the right. Hoary red poles are paler in general. Their streaks are usually less defined or non-existent. If we look at this picture, we can see it's got a pretty stubby bill versus that common right next to it. So hoary red pole does tend to have a smaller bill. It almost looks like it's shoved into their face, which creates a kind of unique facial expression that you can see here. The other thing that I've seen on the couple of hoaries I've seen and the lots of common is that hoary tends to have a less extensive red forehead than common. At least this one definitely did. Some of the other ones I've looked at as well. The key features, though, aren't even visible on this bird. This is another hoary red pole from McKean County. This was from 2020. The first one was from 2021. It was the same eruption, different locations, probably different birds. So this one's showing us the very clean white undertail coverts on a common red pole. Those will be streaked. As far as I know, flight call wise, they're the same. So you can identify those chid. Those are going to be red poles, but you wouldn't necessarily pick a hoary out by flight call. The other key field mark is on top of the tail, under the wings. That's a clean white rump. Hoary red pole has a nice white rump, whereas common red pole has usually a heavily streaked rump. And again, these birds are pretty approachable, so usually you can get, with enough tries, you can get good looks at those field marks. I do not have any hoary red pole recordings, I'm sorry. Okay, so where are you looking for red poles? Again, you're looking at deciduous tree seeds, mainly birch, alder. For me, I've actually been kind of disappointed this fall. I thought we might get a couple of straggler red poles. And I live in Tioga County, so I've been birding Hammond Lake, which is surrounded by a really nice alder state with lots of cones and catkins, and the pine siskins have been going nuts up there, but no red poles. So it has not been a good year for red poles. Okay, so now we can talk about the real specialists, the crossbills. So we have 2 species of crossbills in North America. Well, we have 3 species of crossbills in North America: red crossbill, white-winged crossbill, and cassia crossbill, which is a subset of red crossbill that was split out, I think, 2 years ago due to geographic range in Idaho. So we don't have cassia crossbill as far as we know. We have red crossbills and we have white-winged crossbills. And red crossbills, I'll start off with. Red crossbills are unique because they're divided into a bunch of subgroups. And I don't call them subspecies because typically subspecies designation has to do with isolated geographic range. And crossbills are not isolated, and their geographic range is wherever there's cones. So they move around quite a bit. They don't necessarily associate with one set breeding area. But what they do make is flight calls, and the flight calls seem to be different enough between several different groups of red crossbills that they formulated a system for identifying them to call type. So instead of subspecies, they're call types. And each call type has a preferred tree seed that they focus on. They will feed on any sort of conifer cones, but some types of red crossbills are more focused on smaller cone species, and thus they have smaller bills. The larger billed red crossbill, like type 2, feeds on larger cones. The nice part is, if you're into recording birds, you can have a lot of fun with crossbills when you find them, because oftentimes there's multiple call types in a flock. Even though they do tend to breed with like call types, they will flock together. So here in Pennsylvania right now, I was deer hunting in November, and I recorded a type 2 red crossbill. And then the next day I recorded a type 1 red crossbill. So there are multiple call types in the state right now, and that's a fun puzzle to put together. I don't know what these red crossbills were. Again, this picture is from Sioux City, Iowa. My guess would be type 3 because they do look like they've got pretty small bills, which type 3 does. And also type 3 tends to come out of the Mountain West and into the Midwest. And we were in the Midwest at the time. So they're probably type 3, but I did not get a good recording to confirm that. Oh, so let's talk about those crossbill calls. Go and share back to eBird here. Crossbill flight call, red crossbill. Sounds like it's saying kip, 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 kip or jip. And typically the notes are either paired, tripled, sometimes they're singly, but those are your flight calls. So let me see what I can find here. These are the type 2s that I recorded out at my deer camp. All right, so that's a type 2. And then I think this is the type 1 that I recorded the next day. So very similar sounding calls, but if you do the analysis of the spectrogram, which is what we're looking at here, you can zoom in on them. You can see subtle differences to tell the difference in call type. I'll be honest, I wagered a guess on both of these and it was correct both times, but I sent them to Matt Young at Cornell, who actually identified them to type. So I enjoy analyzing the recordings, trying to figure out the call types, but I don't put them in eBird as one type or another until somebody who's got more knowledge than me confirms what I'm thinking. So it's sort of a new frontier with birding. Crossbill call types have been identified for over 10 years, but we're still learning more things about them. In North America, there are 12 distinct call types. 2 of those 12 are actually found in the eastern United States normally. Type 1 is the Appalachian red crossbill. That's Appalachian Mountains. I've recorded that one at random times a year throughout Pennsylvania. The other one is type 12, which is northeastern red crossbill. That's one you would find typically in like northern New England, New York, but I've also recorded that one in Pennsylvania as well. So these call types are moving all over the continent. Go back to our PowerPoint here. Okay, so on to the white-winged crossbill. I had to steal one of my wife's original illustrations for this because I do not have a picture of a white-winged crossbill that I took. For me, white-winged crossbill has been much more difficult to find than red crossbill. I've only encountered one. That is not always true. Some eruptions, there are tons of white wings and not very many reds. Other eruptions, there's mostly reds and no white wings. So it really just depends on where the birds are at and what the cone crops look like there. So I had actually hoped that this fall would be good for white-winged crossbill, but I didn't end up really finding any. The other thing about white-winged crossbill is that I don't have a lot of audio recordings for them, but I do have one. So we're going to listen to that one. White-winged crossbills, their calls are different from red crossbills. They're much closer to common redpoll. Does sound sort of like a typewriter. It's like a chid, but it's very flat. It does not have the descending quality that the redpoll has, and it does not have the same cadence as a goldfinch. So I will go ahead and pull up my one lonely white-winged crossbill recording here. So lonely. Not the best recording. It's the only one I've got. And actually, if we take mine off, we might find some good ones in here. Let's see. Try to get one that's not the song. This might be a good one. That one was a fast typewriter. I'll go back to our PowerPoint. So another thing to note about the two crossbill species is that white-wing tends to have a smaller bill and red tends to have a bigger bill. What that means is that tree species with bigger cones tend to attract red crossbill. Think eastern white pine, Norway spruce, the larger pine species out west. The white-winged crossbill tends to be attracted to smaller cone species. Think hemlock, tamarack, that's your larch, and also different types of ornamental spruce that are not Norway spruce. So white and red spruce here in Pennsylvania are often planted. They have smaller cones. Norway spruce has those big honking cones, 5-6 inches long, like a white pine. They're more attractive for red crossbill. White-winged crossbill can feed on them, but they preference the smaller cones because of the smaller bill. Okay, again, the crossbills are conifer specialists. They really don't feed on hardly anything else. They are one of the few in this group that actually feeds their young with seeds. So white-wing and red crossbill are feeding their young a slurry of seeds, whereas evening grosbeaks, pine siskin, purple finch, those birds are going out and catching insects, maybe mixing seeds in, but they're feeding young with a lot of insects. So crossbills don't necessarily do that. I do want to mention purple finch, even though a lot of us are probably familiar with that one. It is a year-round residence. It breeds in Pennsylvania. Just some identification notes. Purple finch can cause problems with identifying them versus the house finch. That's a little more common at backyard feeders. Some things to note on this bird. Number one, short tail that's deeply notched. House finch tends to have a longer tail. It's not typically notched. Sometimes it looks notched, but not usually. If you look at the bill, the profile of the bill, especially between the two, the upper and lower portion of the bill is straight. That margin on a house finch, it is curved down. And then if you look at the head, purple finch is a stocky finch with a big head, and it has a big white eye stripe, whereas house finch is more of a long and lean shape with a smaller head, and neither the male or the female have an eyebrow like that, where male purple finches also have that. It just is a little paler purple than the rest of their head. So that's how you would identify a purple finch visually. You can also use the flight calls, just like our other finches. And purple finch is actually, purple finch and pine siskin are the two finch flight calls that I learned first. So I'll go with that, pull purple finch up. And I have a lot of purple finch songs that I've recorded, but only a couple of flight calls. So the flight call is a very soft popping call. Might not be able to hear it well on here, but hopefully it works. And that might be a tough one for folks, especially folks that struggle with hearing to hear. But it is quite distinctive if you can hear it and you can learn it. That's a good way to be clued into an eruption because than you might think. Okay, back to our PowerPoint. We'll keep moving along. Purple finches are feeding on a variety of these food sources. So they will feed on some smaller cones. They will also go for those deciduous tree seeds. They will readily come into feeders and feed on black oil sunflower seed. So they're kind of the generalists in this group in terms of what food sources they're going for. All right, evening grosbeaks, big and showy. We've got 2 more finches left to talk about. Evening grosbeaks are a fan favorite for birders and non-birders alike. They're big, bigger than cardinals. So we're talking about a big blue jay sized bird that's yellow and black, and females are this really great low profile contrast of grays and yellows and whites. They got that massive bill. Evening grosbeaks are a real showstopper. And they are one that I have found most of the time when I come in contact with evening grosbeaks, it's flight calls. They have a very loud flight call. And for me, it was easy to learn because it sounded like a combination of 2 calls that I hear pretty commonly. One would be the typical contact call of a house fin or a house sparrow, and the other would be the clear call of a northern flicker. So if you take those 2 calls and you smash them together, you end up with this evening grosbeak flight call that I'm going to play for you. It's oftentimes described as a cheer or a tier type flight call. This is going to take a while to load. Okay. So that's your evening grosbeak flight call. Let's see. So that call and this one coming up here in just a second, those are what's called the bury call. So hopefully that gives you an idea about what to listen for evening grosbeak. I really like the crossbills because of the different call types, but if I had to pick a favorite finch, it's probably evening grosbeaks. Evening grosbeaks are kind of a unique one. It does list them as going for conifer cones, and they will feed in conifers, but they're much more closely tied to deciduous tree seeds, particularly maples and ash. So the Samara seeds, I always called them helicopters as a kid. So evening grosbeaks are feeding on those types of tree seeds. Box elder, which is a type of maple that actually holds its seeds in the winter, seems to be a staple food source. Box elder is a pretty common ornamental planting, but it's also common along waterways. So if you've ever been driving along a river or a creek and you've seen a bunch of deciduous trees with no leaves, but all these big clumps of seeds, it's probably box elder. It's a good idea to note where you see that, because in the years where you know there's evening grosbeaks coming down, that's a good spot to look. All right, last but not least, we have what was at one point in time a serious nemesis bird for me, pine grosbeak. This is probably the least common bird on this list for Pennsylvania. Pine grosbeak is more common across its breeding territories than evening grosbeak. In fact, evening grosbeaks had huge population declines, but for whatever reason, they just typically don't tend to make it this far south in normal eruption years. A big part of that might be their food sources. So pine grosbeaks are fruit eaters, and ornamental fruits like crab apples are found in pretty much every city and town, everywhere. So they do tend to hop around on food sources. The only pine grosbeaks I've ever seen, despite making multiple trips to northern New England where they're fairly common in the winter, was just outside of Boston, 2021, during the 2020 flight year. There was a flock that was coming into a group of crab apples in the back of an office park. And those are the only pine grosbeaks I've ever seen. They're typically difficult the further south you go out of those breeding areas. They do tend to be drawn into fruit. So they're eating almost exclusively fruits. So if you have fruiting plants in your yard, you have a shot with them. They are big, just like evening grosbeaks. They're large finches. I don't know their vocalizations very well. I've never recorded them, so I can't help you as much on that one. But I will say, if you see a pine grosbeak, enjoy that. The one experience I had with them was really great. I would love to see them more. I just don't have that much information about them because I haven't dealt with them that much. All right, any questions?
Yes, we have some good questions.
Perfect.
Q&A. I'm going to start with one that I think you sort of already addressed but posted before you got to the evening grosbeaks. So, but you could try to clarify. You said finches have regional variation in their calls. Do they associate and breed others who do not speak their dialect?
That's a great question. So far, the preliminary research that I've read about shows that the red crossbills typically choose mates from the same call type. They will associate with other call types, but that they're typically breeding with the same call type. Evening grosbeaks also have call types. There are 3. We only really get type 3 here in Pennsylvania. That's like your Eastern Canada boreal forest breeder. The other 2 call types are found in the Mountain West, and they are typically migrating shorter distances between elevation and lower elevation, and not necessarily continent wide the way type 3 does. And I don't know whether they interbreed between those call types or not, but with red crossbill, it doesn't appear that that's the case. At least not typically.
Yeah. Can you comment on how non-native spruces, such as Norway, might impact finch eruptions in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, a lot of the spruces in Pennsylvania are planted non-natives. We do have some small boreal patches of forest where we have native spruces in Pennsylvania, but most of them are planted. Here at Sinnamahoning, we had planted white spruce plantation. We also have Norway spruces throughout the park. And the main thing for that is that they provide food. So a lot of these finches will feed on those cones. Red crossbill will feed in Norway spruce for sure. They're large. They do tend to produce a lot of cones. And I've noticed, especially with Norway spruce, sometimes a big Norway spruce will produce a good number of cones in back-to-back years, which doesn't really happen with white pine. Native white pine is more of like a 3 to 5 year cycle between bumper crops. So they may provide more consistent food sources. The issue is that they don't support the same types of insects. So for our native breeding species of birds, they're not necessarily as good as our native species of trees. But for finches, those ornamental trees like crab apples and things like that can provide a food source in winter that holds them in an area and makes it possible for us to see and study them.
Great. Can the Merlin Bird ID app distinguish the red crossbill call types?
Not yet. It is remarkably good with finch flight calls in general. I will say that. I make all of my recordings on Merlin for lack of a better recording technology. But I will say that it typically gets flight calls right in terms of finch flight calls. It does not yet, I think, identify a call type. I want to say it may have thrown up a call type once for me, but I don't know if that's true or not. I might have just been me dreaming about it.
Yeah, I've never been able to, it's never shown me any call type when I've run my bill recordings through it. So that's my experience as well. Okay, this is a question. It came up before the pine grosbeak section, but I'll read it. If you were going to talk later about pine grosbeaks. This can wait. I'm gathering rare bird records in Butler County and Western PA in general. And I found numerous records of pine grosbeak eruptions, sometimes in numbers enough to cause damage to pine plantings. But all those records are pre-1975. It seems the species does not visit us nowadays. Have their numbers collapsed in Canada, or are they just well fed so they don't need to move?
Well, this is a great question, and I'll sort of pivot it a little bit. For evening grosbeak, yes, there's been a significant population decline for evening grosbeak. Those of you who were birders in the 80s and 90s probably remember every other year there was probably really good flights of evening grosbeaks at that point in time. But those of us who started birding in the 2000s and early 20 teens like me, I never remembered evening grosbeaks being around until 2018 when we had a really good flight year in New England. And I know some of my contacts in northern New England will tell anybody that will listen that pine grosbeak is much easier to find than evening grosbeak. That being said, the opposite has been true for me. I look for pine grosbeaks and almost never find them. And evening grosbeaks I tend to run into lately, at least in the last couple of flight years. There's probably been population declines. I am not familiar with any of the research that would show that. But I know with evening grosbeak, it's been significant.
Great. So another question for conservation / protecting finches. I assume conifers are important, and or what else can we do to help?
Yep, conifers are important. If you got conifers in your landscaping, that's great. But you can also put out bird feeders. Every single one of these species will visit a bird feeder if the food is available and they're traveling through. So providing high quality food, black oil sunflower seed or thistle seed in your feeders. Thistle will be for the smaller birds. Black oil sunflower seed, pine grosbeak, evening grosbeaks will come to that. And providing them in a feeder that they'll use. They prefer platform feeders. And with the exception of the finches, the thistle feeder, you'll want that. But something as easy as just providing a consistent feeding station during eruption years can have a big impact. The other things that we can do, you can report your sightings during eruption years, especially if you can try and get recordings of red crossbills. Reporting those sightings to eBird or recording red crossbills and uploading them, whether that's to the Finch Eruptions and Mass Crops group on Facebook or directly to eBird. All of that data is helping shape our understanding of finches right now. So when I hear red crossbills, I'm almost kicking myself if I don't get recordings of them. I'm trying to record every red crossbill I come in contact with so that I can get those recordings out, and the people who are smarter than me and who are studying this has a lot of information to do their research. So we as birders can collect that information, and that's an important task.
Great. And that relates to another question we got. Dave wants to know, are you hearing or seeing any crossbills in the park this winter?
The last I heard was actually, I'll call it frustratingly close to the January 1st Bird Atlas start date. It was at the end of December. I had a flock fly over the Wildlife Center towards the campground. I have not been able to come across any more other than that. I had several singing individuals in Clinton County during deer season. But other than that, they've gone kind of quiet for me. Unfortunately, with this part of Pennsylvania, here in northern Pennsylvania, a lot of the high quality crossbill habitat where crossbills are probably breeding is very remote. All the roads are DCNR forestry roads that are either not maintained or they're maintained for snowmobiles, which is not appropriate for our vehicles. So it's hard to get to where they are. I've been doing trying to survey. My wife and I have been trying to survey via cross country ski for the last week or so, but I haven't run into any since the start of the Atlas on January 1st.
Yeah. What is the forecast for this winter? So what does it seem like it's going to be?
So for this winter, the forecast was mixed. So not expecting a flight of redpolls, although it was a possibility. There were sort of mixed reports of the birch cone crops. I was actually thinking that we probably would get a little trickle of redpolls, and that didn't pan out. The big movers were pine siskin was the biggest, and then red crossbill from the western U.S. So the upper Great Lakes, upper Midwest, southern New England, New York, Pennsylvania, we've all gotten pretty good flights of pine siskin and some decent showings from red crossbill. There's been sporadic reports of some of those other species. There's been common redpoll and white-winged crossbill records, I think, from Hawk Mountain this year. That's the other thing to keep in mind is that, just because the Finch forecast says there isn't an eruption doesn't mean you didn't hear a redpoll or an evening grosbeak. It just means you're not likely to find one. So I did see a post in the Connecticut Birders Facebook group. Somebody had said they thought they had a redpoll at their feeder, and there was a couple of really good birders who I know who were like, well, that's not possible. And I'm like, I'm looking at it and I'm like, well, there's been redpolls in Pennsylvania, so it totally could be possible. So just keeping your eyes out no matter what the forecast says. But if you're going to go out looking for finches, you want to check that forecast and make sure there's at least a chance for some of them to be moving. But the big ones this year, pine siskin, red crossbill.
Great. And I mentioned this question. Did anyone ever compare call type between the red crossbills and the European called their common crossbill?
I do not know. I would guess that that is sort of the next frontier for the Finch Research Network. They've been sort of pulling more info, at least on the Facebook group that's associated with them. We've seen more stuff about European finches, so stuff like hawfinch, the European crossbills. There's also pine grosbeak is circumpolar, so they're found in Europe. Some of these species are North American specifically, but some of them are not. Some of them are found across. Common redpoll is another one. So they're found across the high Arctic areas. So they're found in Europe as well. I'd be interested in finding that out. That's one of the things with redpolls is they're like, is there 1, 2, 3, or 6 species? We don't know. I certainly don't know. I'd wait for somebody to tell me.
Fantastic. I think, oh, no, I think that's all the questions I found. Unless, Tony, you think I've missed any.
I'm going through it. I don't see any at the moment.
This is
I
very
know
exciting.
Susan got a few compliments for her illustrations, so very nice job, Susan.
Great. If anybody wants a sticker, she's got pine grosbeak, evening grosbeak, and red crossbill.
Fantastic. Well, let's all thank Matt for his presentation. This was absolutely fantastic.
Yes, thank you, Matt.
Got some thanks in the chat. Tony, any announcements for the group?
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it, and
Yeah.
I look forward.
No
Go for it.
announcements from
Yeah,
the
thanks,
committee,
Matt.
but I know our treasurer Frank Hodge just sent out an email about the upcoming birding festival at the end of May. So a lot of work is being put into that. So hopefully all y'all can join us in Washington for that at the end of May into early June.
Yeah, that's going to be a good one. Well, thanks. We had a great turnout tonight. Great
Yeah, Matt,
audience
this is
questions.
fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
Boy,
glad you
now we
guys liked
all
it.
just
Great.
get out there and see the birds. I'm going to
Fantastic.
end the recording, and thanks again.